So thank you for everyone for joining. I'm Jane Hauser. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach at NESCA. We are here tonight for the webinar, Transition Planning for Students on an IEP, presented by Kelley Challen, who is NESCA's Director of Transition Services. We really want to thank the Nashoba, Maynard, and Northborough, Southborough CPAC groups for organizing and funding this webinar and making it available to everyone. Once the presentation is completed, we'll move on to a live Q&A. And if you have questions, you can certainly type them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, but know that we will get to them at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties or other questions, you can certainly add them to the chat, and we will also address those when we get to the end of the presentation. If we are not able to get to all of the questions at the end in our Q&A, please feel free to reach out to me or to Kelley directly, and we will be sure to get you some answers to your questions. So with that, I will turn this over to Kelley and we can get right into the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Good evening. I'm Kelley Challen. I'm the Director of Transition Services at NESCA, as Jane said. So I oversee our post-secondary transition coaching, planning, consultation, and assessment services. And I've been at NESCA since 2013, but I've been engaged in evaluation, development, and direction of transition-focused programs for teenagers and young adults with a wide range of developmental and learning abilities since 2004. Which is a long time. I want to say a quick but significant thank you to Nashoba, CPAC and Maynard CPAC and Northborough Southborough PAC for hosting this talk on a really important subject. I find it hard. I'm a parent, and I also find it hard to be a professional who has expertise in transition planning, but to have been practicing in this area, working with transition age students for 20 years, to know how important this really is for students, and to also know how many parents and educators haven't really had the benefit of having substantial training on this specific area of special education. So I am grateful to be here with you all tonight and to just give you a little bit of a glimpse into what's such an important area for our kids. If you're unfamiliar with NESCA, I just want to take a quick moment to talk about our practice. We're a group practice with offices in Newton, Plainville, and Hingham, Massachusetts, as well as Londonderry, New Hampshire, and we have satellite sites in satellite staff up in Burlington, Vermont, Brooklyn, New York. We specialize in assessment, treatment, and consultation services for children, adolescents, and young adults with special needs, whether mild or complex. And I think sometimes things we think are mild are really complex, and things we think are complex, there can be great support for. So we don't always know what, you may not always know what you're needing as a parent, but I love that we specialize in a wide range. Our clinical staff is comprised of 15 expert neuropsychologists and 5 transition specialists who have a mix of backgrounds in school and guidance counseling, occupational therapy, special education, and vocational rehabilitation counseling, as well as we have social workers, occupational therapists, school psychologists, special educators, and consultants at NESCA. So we really are multidisciplinary. It was founded in 2007 as a neuropsychology practice, but we've had transition specialists on staff and offered transition services at NESCA since 2009, essentially since the beginning of the practice. So this means that thinking about transition planning is really ingrained, and each of our clinicians aims to provide thorough and accurate testing that can support a family and team in creating a roadmap for helping a child progress toward adult life. So it's a lot of information about NESCA and us. I typically like to pause and just have you, if you can, type in a little bit of information about yourself into the chat. Just if you want to let me know like what town you're from and what age of child or children you have, or if you're a professional, what age you tend to work with. It's really sometimes helpful just to see who's in the room and who's thinking about transition planning. So if you guys want to type in some of that information, I'll move ahead and start talking about our agenda. All right. Oh, this is great. Thank you guys so much for jumping in here. So we do have pretty good range of parents and some educators in here. Some folks who have older children who are, what we say about to age out of special education, so 21 heading on 22, but also some parents of students on the younger side, and as I said, and parents of kids even 12 and up, which is awesome because you really want to understand this process before you get here if you can. So this is great. Nice wide range. Hopefully I can speak to um, things that are going to be supportive for people at all different points in this process. What I'm hoping to do tonight, define transition planning and review what the law says about IEP transition planning, touch upon why transition planning needs to begin early and how it looks in the IEP, and then spend some time discussing skills that make a difference in successful transition planning. I think we spend so much time thinking about what are the important goal areas for our kids' IEPs. And I really feel like it's important to understand, well, what does research say makes the biggest difference in terms of skill development for students who are going to transition to post-secondary adult life? So I want to talk about that. And I'm hoping to leave about 20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. And as Jane said, just want you to save your questions for that point in time. But certainly, if I use a term or phrase that needs clarification, speak up. So type into the chat right away if you need something clarified. I don't want to lose anybody in the content. All right, so transition is a word that we hear a lot about. But what does it mean? What am I talking about in the context of transition planning? So I could share the Merriam-Webster definition of the word transition, but I think it's a little more relevant to start with this definition of transition for youth with disabilities from Andrew Halpern. And it indicates that transition refers to a change in status from behaving primarily as a student to assuming emergent adult roles in the community. And I think one of the things that's really important to recognize about transition is like transition is happening to a young person, right? A young person is making a transition, but it's a change in status. So for all of us who work with or who parent kids, right? Like that there are changes in dynamics also that happen during transition, right? Changes in relationships, changes in who's taking the lead and what. So it's a big deal. And for students on IEPs, transition is a legal right. And it's specifically based in federal law and regulations. And I love being a transition specialist because the law is the same across the country for transition, even if there are some things that we have more protections about in Massachusetts, right? But so this is powerful. It's based right in IDEA. If you have a child on an IEP or work with children who receive special ed services, you're probably familiar with what I just mentioned, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, or IDEA 2004. This is a law that ensures that students with disabilities throughout the country have the right to a free, appropriate public education. You may have heard the term FAPE before. And so it's our kids have a right to free public education, and it's got to be appropriate to who the children are or who the young adults are. Moreover, the federal law mandates that the purpose of special education and related services is to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities and to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And if we were in the room together, I would ask everyone, raise your hands to indicate if you know, or if you knew before you came in tonight, that special education was explicitly about preparing children with disabilities to go on to further learning and or training, to be competitively employed, and to live independently in their community. And either no or very few hands would rise up because we often think about special education as access to, academics, right? Access to learning right now. But the real purpose of special education, which is right in the law, is that we're working to prepare students for what comes after public education. We need to be doing that from the minute our kids get onto IEPs. So one of the primary mechanisms by which special education prepares students with disabilities for these post-secondary activities is the provision of transition services. And transition services are also described and defined in IDEA. So within the definition of IEP, the law states that beginning not later than the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16. And we have more protections in Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, we have state regs that say that we need to begin this in the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 14 or younger if determined appropriate by the IEP team. And then it needs to be updated annually. And the IEP must include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, which are based on age-appropriate transition assessments, which are related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. And the IEP also has to have in it transition services, including course of study, which are going to be needed to assist the child in reaching those goals. So I want to break down a few of the terms from the previous slide. The IEP needs to include post-secondary goals that are measurable or countable outcomes that the student aspires to achieve upon exiting public education. There should be one measurable post-secondary goal for each specified adult outcome area. So we need to see one specific education and/or training goal, one specific employment goal, and one specific goal related to independent living, which can also include community engagement. The law does say that independent living is included when appropriate, but the only way a team can choose not to include a post-secondary independent living goal is if they have data demonstrating that this isn't appropriate for the student. So we can't just blanketly decide that independent living is not appropriate. We have to have done some sort of assessment in that area, right? I also like to mention that it's not acceptable to think of educational or vocational training as separate, to think of educational or vocational training and employment as separate tracks. So a student who wants to go to college also needs to have an employment goal that's listed in their IEP, and a student who wants to work needs to have a goal listed for necessary or desired education and training. And what I am so grateful for is that even though this has been the law all along, and the Massachusetts regulations have not changed at all in terms of the requirement to include post-secondary goals in the IEP, what has changed this school year, or in a few districts last school year, is the inclusion of more space in the IEP for documenting these legally required goals. And the old IEP was a little confusing because the vision section, right, the vision section up here that we have in our IEPs when the kids turn 3, it stayed the same. And a lot of times we didn't notice this language here that said beginning no later than age 14, the statement should be based on the student's preferences and interests and should include desired outcomes in adult living and post-secondary and working environments. And so sometimes there might be a tendency to keep just talking about what's going to happen in 1 to 5 years. But what's required by the law is to be talking about what are the outcomes going to be of special education? What are the outcomes going to be when this student graduates? What are the outcomes going to be when the student turns 22 if a student's going to stay that long, right? So it used to be that there wasn't as sort of much clarity around how to document this. And the new IEP specifically has 3 lines to ensure that every student has an education or training plan. Every student has an employment plan. Every student has an independent living plan, right? Something that I don't love is that there isn't anywhere in the section specifically, like, because this is the first page of the IEP, and there isn't anywhere to document right there what the age-appropriate transition assessments were that were used to determine these goals. But there is room to document those assessments in other parts of the IEP. And these are the goals that we need to be talking about, at the start of every meeting, right? And I certainly appreciate that it's really hard to do everything required and not create redundancy within the IEP. So I'm just happy it's all there, even if it's not linear, for my brain anyways. So post-secondary goals, they're super important. Let's go back to some other definitions, right? The IEP has to have post-secondary goals, and it has to have transition services that are needed to progress toward those goals. And transition services are also defined in IDEA. So transition services are a coordinated set of activities that are designed to be within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and the functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities. And those post-school activities can include post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, but again, competitive, work for pay out in the universe, continuing in adult education, adult services, independent living, and overall community participation. So again, transition services are going to facilitate movement toward all of these life goals. Transition services is based on the individual student's needs, but it also takes into account that student's strengths and preferences and interests. And it includes all of these different things. Transition services can be instruction. They can be related services. They can be community experiences. They can also be development of objectives, right? Development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. And for some students, when it's appropriate, it's going to be acquisition of daily living skills. And I would say for many students, it is acquisition of daily living skills and also functional vocational evaluation. There are more hands-on kinds of activities that are required for transition services for a number of students. All right, so when should transition assessment happen, right? If the law says we need to have post-secondary goals that are have been determined through age-appropriate transition assessment, and we need to have transition services in the IEP that's in effect in the year the student turns 14, then transition assessment needs to happen prior to that time. And I think that's something that's a little bit complicated because most of our students need to have transition assessment in middle school. I mean, they need it in high school too, but it needs to start at age 13 at the latest if we're going to go ahead and develop an IEP that's based on age appropriate transition assessment that's going to be in effect when our kids turn 14. Right? I mean, unfortunately, our IEP meetings and our kids' birthdays, they may start aligned, but they certainly don't end there when we get to these ages. So it's just so important to be thinking about this. So I really appreciate some of the parents who are on the call who are 12. Like you guys have this opportunity to get on this, right when we're supposed to be doing it, which is great. So what is transition assessment? That's not actually defined in the law, but we do have an accepted federal definition. And this comes from the Division on Career Development and Transition of the Council for Exceptional Children. And it describes transition assessment as an ongoing process of collecting data on the individual's needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future working, educational, living, and personal and social environments. Transition assessment's ongoing because we should be frequently measuring progress, adjusting goals, moving forward, checking our progress. And if we need to be updating a student's post-secondary measurable goals annually based on age-appropriate transition assessment, then some type of transition assessment needs to be happening every year so that we can do that. But that doesn't mean that you need to evaluate every aspect of a student's strengths, preferences, interests, and needs every year. If you do really thorough transition planning, from the get-go, or at whatever point in time you can, you shouldn't need to make major changes after that. Even when a student's goals change, a lot of times their sort of foundational skills for progressing towards those goals, like they sort of are where they are, and we might just be tweaking some of the activities, right? Or tweaking some of the more career planning kinds of things. This is a model that I've tried to put together to just show like everything that needs to come out of a transition assessment. And I want to just pause and say a transition assessment doesn't actually have to be just like one assessment. Transition assessment can be a process. It can be multidisciplinary. It can be including the multiple different assessments that a team does. But we need to have enough transition assessment data that we can figure out a student's post-secondary goals related to, right, education and training, employment, and independent living. And we need to understand the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. And we need to have a sense of what the students' needs are and the transition services that they're going to need. So the coursework, instruction-related services, career and college planning activities, functional evaluation that might be needed, community experiences, daily living skills, right? So all of these are what we're trying to get as outcomes from a transition assessment process. With regard to assessment tools, just like any kind of testing a student has, there are lots of tools to choose from for transition assessment. And in fact, there are probably more potential tools than any other assessment or type of evaluation process that a student would participate in, right? Transition assessment tools can be formal, but many of the great ones are also informal. Every child on an IEP has had some formal assessments. These are generally the standardized published tests with specific procedures that are reliable and valid, and they're often norm referenced, right? These are sometimes the things we use for eligibility of students on IEPs. And those can still provide a really good starting point because students have often already undergone this type of evaluation. Formal assessments are necessarily administered by a professional with requisite qualifications. But I want to pause here and point out that there isn't one type of licensed or unlicensed professional who's qualified to administer transition assessment. So who it is at your particular school that is doing some of this evaluation or parts of the evaluation, the whole evaluation, really depends on who's had the experience and training to administer the types of testing that your child needs, right? So sometimes a school psychologist has had the most experience with a formal adaptive functioning measure, formal life skills measure. But there are plenty of formal assessments that can be administered by anyone with a master's degree, and we have a lot of staff with master's degrees in our schools here in Massachusetts. So, it's not necessarily obvious who's going to be part of the transition assessment process. Informal assessment is everything else, right? Observing the student systematically, talking with the family and teachers and providers through an unstructured or structured interview, can be curriculum-based assessments, right? Progress reporting is part of transition assessment. It can be teacher-made. I mean, there's some great homemade kinds of tools or teacher-made tools for transition assessment, and it can include measures that are really inexpensive or free. Because a lot of informal data is so great for transition assessment, it's also more subjective and intuitive and requires clinical judgment. So it's important to think about who's conducting those evaluations, how they're interpreting them, and what their experience is with that. A few types of informal assessment that I like to highlight include person-centered planning frameworks for students who benefit from a more visually based process. There are things like path and maps and personal futures planning. There's been a lot of interest in charting the life course, which is a wonderful framework that has some very nice visual and sort of taking into account a lot of different parts of transition planning. And these types of processes place greater weight on getting data from a variety of people who know the student well. Also, functional community-based assessments can be critical, right? Years ago, there was a transition specialist at the Federation for Children with Special Needs here in Massachusetts named Terry McLaughlin. And she always used to say, you can't take a swim test without a pool, right? So we can't just sit in a classroom to assess a student's community skills. We might be able to interview people who've seen the student in the community and qualify the fact that that student actually has great pedestrian skills. But we can't get all the data if we only think of seeing the student in the classroom and we only talk to people who've seen the student in the classroom. And as far as the balance between formal and informal testing, transition assessment must have formal and informal measurements to meet the guidelines set forth in the law. But very technically, one assessment from column A and column B meets that criteria. And the more important thing is that we have enough assessment data to really do, what I had outlined on this slide, right? So it's not which assessments are picked, it's do we have the information we need after we've conducted an assessment process. So, over the years, I've certainly had different parents or educators that I've talked to, and they're concerned, that their student has never had a transition assessment. And the reality is, if a kid gets to middle school or high school and has been on an IEP for any amount of time, you've had transition assessment, right? Everything on this slide might be part of transition assessment. So all the data that's been collected during 3-year evaluations is relevant. State standardized competency testing, such as MCAS, is important if we're thinking about graduation being part of a student's vision, because that's been required to obtain a diploma, right? But also, even though many colleges don't require admissions tests, I encourage taking standardized tests. They're really helpful for students to get a sense of their competency for college in comparison to how other students might be ready for college in other places across the country or in other schools across Massachusetts, right? We know that grades are not necessarily a great predictor of readiness for college, especially if students have had any modifications in high school, or just with the level of accommodations that we can do in a high school, which aren't the same as what you can do in a college. So standardized tests provide a nice snapshot of how a student performs that task in comparison to other students. Um, and in addition to tests, standardized tests, things like progress reports, guidance curriculum, such as Naviance or SCORE, can be part of transition assessment. But what I like to also point out is that while everything counts as transition assessment, right? Everything on this slide, right? It's important that all transition assessments are listed in the IEP, right? That the data makes it into the IEP and that we have accurate reporting of the students' educational and functional performance, strengths, needs, progress toward their goals, personal attributes and accomplishments, preferences and interests, right? It's not enough to just be doing these activities. We need to be considering in team meetings how these impact the transition planning process. I often tell a story. I think it's about 5 years ago now. I was working with a school district who's funding a transition assessment. They printed off a 9-page document for me that listed all of the assessments they had done for the student. Some were evaluations, some were just activities. None of them were listed in the IEP. It wasn't clear to me then if the team had ever reviewed the information when they developed the IEP. And there were some clear concerns that the family had expressed that weren't addressed by any of those 9 pages of tests, right? So we got two challenges here, which is I can't tell if the data has been incorporated into the IEP process, and we may have done 9 pages of activities that maybe weren't the most concerning areas in terms of this student's transition. I just want to briefly talk about where transition assessment results can be documented in the IEP. Certainly the post-secondary goals that we already discussed are one place where assessment results are documented because the students' post-secondary goals are required to be based on age-appropriate transition assessment. So hopefully we see some information about that in the assessment reports. Two other places where most transition assessment results will be documented are the present levels sections of the new IEP and the post-secondary transition planning section of the new IEP. So whereas the previous IEP included a summary of key evaluation results altogether, the new IEP calls for much more detailed performance data to be documented across several areas. So for students of all ages, there's a section to describe the student's current performance related to academics, behavior, social and emotional functioning, communication, and there's an additional areas section where you can actually start talking about a student's activities of daily living or life skills as early as is appropriate. Health, hearing, motor and mobility, sensory vision, all of these things affect transition planning, and there might be information that comes out of transition assessment related to these. And then for students approaching age 14, there's this added section specifically related to post-secondary transition planning, which leaves room to document current performance related to future education and training goals, employment, and post-secondary independent living and community engagement. So we've got space to document it. We just have to be thoughtful about kind of moving it into different sections as opposed to how we used to lump it together. And I tend to think like there isn't one perfect place for data to go in the new IEP. It's sort of like, let's just get it in there, be able to work with it as a team. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Because transition assessment is so broad and so much assessment has already been done, we need to have a way to figure out where to start. A needs assessment can be a really important place to start. You know, thinking about what do we already know about the student's strengths, interests, preferences, needs, and vision or goals, and then what do we not have information about? And what's the best way to get that information? And it's not always like tests, right? There's a lot of different ways to collect this information. This is one example of a form that could be helpful for conducting a needs assessment. This is the transition assessment planning form, which is easy to find through a Google search. It was developed by Mary Morningstar at University of Kansas. There are multiple versions of this form, but it gives you a way to think about what's already known and what areas might need to be evaluated as part of a thorough transition assessment. And I'm not saying every student needs everything on this form, right? It's a brainstorming session and sort of a way of thinking through and planning. A different way you might conduct a needs assessment is just through a review of the new IEP document and considering all of the places that are available for documenting current performance data and where you don't have any baseline performance information or information about a student's strengths, interests, and preferences. And as we said, like part of transition services can be doing some activities that are going to help a student to better define employment goals or doing functional vocational evaluations so that we have more information. So if we don't have the best of, if the current performance data is we don't know what the current performance is, we can start from there and be planning some activities as part of the process. It doesn't mean that the student has to spend like hours and hours and hours in assessment right now, depending on how old that student is and how important that information is. There is one additional guiding question that I think is just so important to ask yourself, the student, and the team, right? Which is, what is the biggest worry about transitioning to adult life? So if we think about, if we're planning a transition assessment, if you're completing a transition assessment form, like we want to make sure that we've specifically addressed worries that people have for the student. So we're not just thinking like, hey, I want a comprehensive assessment, because someone can do a very comprehensive assessment of a student and it might be a 20-page report that doesn't cover what the biggest concern is about the student. So it's important to identify if you're worried because your child has no idea what kind of work they can do after high school. And it's really important to you to make sure that career interests and aptitudes are part of the process. If you're really worried that a student's, going to be socially isolated when they exit, and you really want to have a better understanding of social and community and leisure and self-advocacy skills, right? So really identifying what are we worried about and making sure that we have thought about that as part of the assessment process. Personally, these are some guidelines that I think transition assessment should include. This is my opinion. There's a little bit of law in here, but it's my opinion. So I think it's really important that there's at least one transition planning inventory or assessment completed, right? Something that looks across all the areas of transition planning that's relatively easy to complete. Just so that we're getting those baselines and knowing where we might need additional assessment over time, and making sure we haven't like forgotten to think about a particular area of transition planning. Formal and informal measures we already talked about. Clear measurements of frequency and level of support and dependence. Not just, does Joey show up at school every day looking neat, but like how many hours did Joey's parent have to spend at home making sure that they, were dressed and not in smelly clothing and, had deodorant, et cetera, right? So it's not just thinking about how often something happens, but what's the level of support that helped the student to demonstrate that behavior that often. It's so important to have information from the student themselves, from parents and guardians, family members, and from school through questionnaire and or interview, right? It's important to have different data points on the student. And if there are really important people involved in a student's life, we want to make sure we have information from them. Like I think about it was a student who was deaf and hard of hearing, and the teacher of the deaf happened to have the most information about that student's preferences and wasn't part of the assessment process. And that's then we have sort of like not enough information about a student. So just thinking about making sure that people who know the student well should be included. Functional measures of student performance. So again, not just like what do we think the student can do or what do they have the knowledge about, but what do they functionally do? And situational assessments in environments related to post-secondary visions and goals. So again, I'm not saying we take 12-year-olds and take them on college tours, but as students are getting older, have we seen them in settings that are like the settings they're supposed to be in when they exit? And how do they function, right? And what might still be needed? If a student's college bound, we really need to think about whether they're meeting the local district requirements, but also are they meeting college application requirements, and are they meeting some of the requirements that would be needed even to obtain a college degree in their area of interest eventually, right? Right now, high school exit exams like MCAS in Massachusetts are important. And as I said, also college placement tests, I think, provide a lot of valuable data. Academic skills are important, and executive functioning skills are critical. Self-determination skills are so very important for students who are college bound, but for students who are really going to be doing anything in adulthood, you need to be able to advocate for yourself to work with our human service agencies in adult life. You need to be able to advocate for yourself to get accommodations in college, but also when you're going to use those accommodations, and then if somebody denies use of those accommodations. Um, a student's involvement in the college process is also data. It's very important data. Is somebody else having to push them through the essay, or do they have some intrinsic motivation? Like, we need to really think about that. Also, situational assessments on the college campus, how does a student respond when they're on college tours, things like that. I love to see students be able to take college classes or audit them. And overnight experience. If a student's going to live away at college, have they ever had any experiences living overnight away from parent? Do they go on school trips when the school goes to other states or things like that, right? Just thinking about, what do we know about the skills the student needs to have to be able to make that leap? And for students who have more limited cognitive or verbal abilities, we need to really focus in on things like interview and observational data, right? Like getting information from people who know that student well if a student has difficulty expressing themselves. We also need to really focus on that student's functional communication and their use of augmentative communication, and how intelligible students are to people who aren't familiar with them. That's critical. You don't get to just have like one person with you in adult life. You're going to have a lot of different service providers. They may be changing. And so we want our kids to be able to advocate for themselves as best as possible, right? Social skills, assistive technology, safety skills, coping skills, and maladaptive behaviors, right? I may have a lot of strengths, but if I behave in ways that are just simply not acceptable in work environments or in community settings, then that creates barriers, right, for community engagement later in life. So we don't want to just ignore, even though I also believe we need to do work, do work on the other side of things, sort of figuring out better ways to include all types of behaviors in our communities. We need to sort of be cognizant of when something's just not going to be accepted, and really be working on that. Also, healthcare transition, things like reducing staffing ratios, finding tasks that students can do with complete independence, and increasing the number and duration of such tasks. And we need to remember that even a student who might be eligible for 24/7 care in adult life isn't actually going to have eyes on them 24 hours a day, right? So just thinking about some specifics for assessment for different kinds of students. Once the student has had a transition assessment, there can be some confusion about what the next steps are in the IEP process. It's not as simple as having a reading evaluation and determining accommodations and services that are needed to meet a reading goal, right? So the way the transition planning process used to work, we had transition assessment. We should have discussed that and looked at the transition planning form, then moved on to the IEP meeting and really concretized the students' post-secondary goals, transition services, annual IEP goals. The only thing that's different now is we don't have that transition planning form, but we do have those post-secondary transition goals right on that first page of the IEP, and that opportunity to talk about transition services throughout, and the IEP goals toward the end of the IEP now, right? So transition planning is a cycle. It begins with assessment, and again, the thing to think about is as we progress forward with our plans for a student, we continue to assess and we move through this process again. When we're in any IEP meeting where transition assessment's being discussed, we should always be creating and revising the student's post-secondary goals based on results of the assessment, right? And that needs to be like the student's engagement and the student's voice. So we're making sure to revise the post-secondary goals for learning and training, employment, and independent living. This is a useful formula for writing each post-secondary goal. We start with a sentence that clearly emphasizes that we're aiming for a post-high school goal, and then specifically describe how the student's going to behave or what activities they're going to do and where and how this will be happening. I just threw this slide back in here again so you can see where the goals are documented in the IEP. The nice thing is, as I said, right, there are sentence starters right on the IEP, and there are places for other team members to express their vision for the student as well down below. Just a few examples of how these goal sentences might be completed. After I finish high school, my education or training plans are to obtain an associate degree in nursing from Mass Bay Community College, to attend a four-year college that's no more than 3 hours drive from my home, to complete a welding certificate program at Minuteman Technical Institute and obtain certification in MIG welding within 1 year, to participate in community-based work training related to automotive with support, right? So just thinking about we want to be as specific as we possibly can. And when we can't be specific, we want to make sure we've got transition services that are helping the student to be more and more specific over time. And really, the more that students have clear goals for themselves, the better the transition is going to be when they finally exit public education. It is a real problem to not have clear goals. Again, we all get to change our goals in life, but it's a real problem to pick the next step if you don't have clear goals when you're getting close to exiting. So we update our goals, and then we need to be thinking about the student's transition service needs. So what experiences must the student participate in this year that are necessary for achieving the identified post-secondary goals? And there are some things that are really time specific, right? Tests you might need to take or activities you might need to engage in. What services and specific instruction are essential this year for the student to develop skills and knowledge to attain their post-secondary goals? And do we know enough about the student's vocational skills to identify an appropriate post-secondary employment goal or design activities to support the identified goal? As I said, if we don't know enough about the student to be able to help them move toward their goals right now, then we certainly need to have something in the IEP that's helping with that, right? If you have no idea what transition and objectives can look like for a student, I recommend doing a Google search for a topic brief on writing transition goals and objectives from Connecticut Department of Education. It's just a multi-page document that lists all sorts of things that can be transition goals and objectives. There's so many different options, which also makes it complicated. But once we've thought about those transition service needs, we also need to make sure that there's at least one annual goal or goals in this year's IEP that's going to help the student make progress toward their post-secondary goals. So there should be at a minimum one annual IEP goal to support education and training, employment, and independent living, including community engagement. Or if independent living is not included, there needs to be a statement in the IEP explaining why no goal or service is needed in that area. So this is where we sometimes, where we're sometimes maybe not as fluid as we should be in transition planning. If we do have strongly worded measurable post-secondary goals, we still need to do the work to crosswalk between those goals and the annual goals and make sure that there's at least one annual goal or objective within an annual goal that's directly aimed at helping the student to make progress toward each one of the post-secondary goals the student has. But I also think about oftentimes a lot of the things that we know are just so important for students are things that are going to help progress towards post-secondary goals. We just want to make sure we're not leaving any areas out, right? That we're not so focused on getting a kid ready for post-secondary learning that we haven't provided them with an opportunity to know enough about themselves to be able to set their career goals well, right? So making sure we're thinking about all the different areas. And when determining annual IEP goals, team needs to ask these questions, right? What skills and knowledge does the student currently have that supports their post-secondary goals? What skills and knowledge must the student attain this year that are necessary for achieving the identified post-secondary goals? Really thinking about course of study here, right? If I have a student who wants to be a doctor at some point, wants to be pre-med concentration in college, then what do they have to take in freshman year or what do they have to take in middle school to be ready for some of the sciences and math coursework that they might need to get through in high school, right? So and if there's specialized instruction needed to help the student do that, then we need to know that, right? So what skills and knowledge they have to attain this year to achieve their identified post-secondary goals, and what services and experiences must the student participate in this year so that they can achieve the identified post-secondary goals. I don't have to show you any examples from the old IEP because this wasn't clearly outlined in the old IEP. But the new IEP has space to document how the student's disability-related needs impact their ability to make progress toward their post-secondary goals. And it also leaves space to identify which section of the IEP are being used to address these needs, right? So we've got sort of baseline information? What are the strengths and interests and preferences that are so important to use in transition planning? And then what's the impact of a student's disability on the specific area of post-secondary transition? And so this is where we're thinking about like, okay, where do we have some challenges that need to be addressed through transition services? And then we say, okay, these identified areas of post-secondary transition will be addressed in which sections? And it could be, any or all of these sections. So a student who's got reduced working memory that could eventually impact their ability to successfully engage with college lectures might have a note-taking accommodation, such as using a smart pen or a software program. That same student might have an objective indicating they're going to use the software to take notes accurately, including at least 3 main ideas and 2 supporting details for each of 4 of 5 measured opportunities, right? Same student might have an assistive technology consultation to ensure that they know how to use their pen and software program well. And maybe in the additional information, there's a note that indicates that this particular student's going to do a summer program at a college, which is going to be paid for by their parents, but they're going to be able to continue using the school's subscription to the software while they're trying that summer program, right? So you might have one area of need that ends up being addressed through a lot of different things, or you may have different ways that you're using the sort of transition services are embedded in here. And honestly, it's more likely that a need's going to be addressed in just 1 or 2 sections, but I wanted to show how just that was an example, clearly. So since we're talking about this section of the IEP, I do want to just run through some of the other transition highlights that you should be discussing at meetings. Projected graduation date now falls in the transition section of the IEP, and it needs to be discussed realistically based on the student's transition service needs, right? So really thinking about, are we on track? Do we need to add more transition services to make sure we're staying on track, or are we not on track for the identified date? And then right here, projected type of completion document. So is this a student we expect to have a diploma or certificate of attainment, or it's really those. And then we talk about planned course of study, which has always been legally required to be in the IEP, but now has a specific place to be discussed. So this is where you might outline, what requirements a student needs to be able to get, and what a student's status is in meeting those requirements, right? So if you're going to get a diploma, what's the course of study need to be? What's the status in relation to that? And it's also where you can document courses and electives a student needs to take to be prepared for their post-secondary goals. So I mentioned, a student who wants to be a computer programmer, maybe they're going to take a computer science class as an elective at some point. Or as I mentioned, maybe a student's very interested in medicine, and so they need to take rigorous science and math classes. If any course requirements are going to be waived, such as foreign language, or sometimes it's math, it would be really important to only do that if it's based on a disability-related reason, and if it would not impact the student's progress toward their post-secondary goals. So we should be having meaningful discussions about whether the high school courses that are going to be part of this student's course of study are rigorous enough, are inclusive enough that the student's going to make a successful transition to a next stage of life and to the activities that they're most interested in. And this is all part of the team process, but it's now also part of the document. There are also spaces to document community and interagency connections. So students may have pre-employment transition services. I was actually on a Zoom meeting on Monday with a woman from Best Buddies, and I know Best Buddies delivers transition services for Algonquin and for Nashoba, and then for Maynard, I think it's Work Opportunities Unlimited. But so there's an opportunity there to talk about this agency and what kind of support they're providing, and also like, how do we get in touch with them? So if the IEP changes hands, it's all there, right? It's really important to connect with multiple community agencies during and after public education, right? We want to have contact with family support centers and autism support centers and behavioral health providers and folk rehab, and eventually, well, not even eventually, Department of Developmental Services can be important, all throughout from 3 to 22 and then beyond. Department of Mental Health for some students, independent living centers. There are so many partners that we can work with in the community to support our students at different ages. Transfer of rights is also on the IEP now, so that there's clear discussion about students taking ownership of education when they turn 18 and they're making a choice about who's going to help or not help with the process. Also, we start to talk about decision making and eventually transfer to adult service agencies. I just want to pause and say there's a lot of confusion sometimes about what 688 referral means in Massachusetts. 688 referral is not technically the direct referral for adult services to actually work with a student. It's actually the referral to get adult service agencies involved in making a plan for after the student exits public education. A lot of times, eligibility happens as part of that process, but it's not just about getting your kid eligible for a service or getting a student eligible for a service. It's about bringing a partner into this transition planning process, and that's really um, why we do this 2 years before a student exits public education. It also triggers for the state of Massachusetts budget, right? If we don't do these on time, there's not enough money in the state budget when students exit to make sure that they get services and make sure this is seamless. So the 688 referral is a really important part of transition planning, which is why I actually went ahead and put the criteria in here, right? So we start to talk about decision making and eventual transfer to adult service agencies. And I just like to highlight here, so, some people are just automatically eligible for 688 referral if they're already with SSI, if they're already listed on the registry with Mass Commission of the Blind, that information's there. But any young adult who's receiving mass special education services, who's going to be in need of continuing services because of the severity of their disability, and you might be wondering, how do we know how severe it is? Well, it's right here. It's any student who's not going to be able to work 20 or more hours per week in competitive employment without any support at all, right? So if your child's going to exit and they can really handle a part-time job, 20 hours a week or more, then we don't necessarily need to be talking about 688 referral. But so many of our students, when they're 2 years before exiting, still haven't had a lot of meaningful engagement with employment. And so we don't have enough information to say, yes, this kid's definitely going to do well at a part-time job, 20 hours a week. So we really need to be thoughtful about this discussion. We want to be making the 688 referrals, right? We really want to try to make sure that there is funding for our kids when they exit. Now, I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I know I've been talking a little fast. I'm going to keep talking a little bit fast. I want to make sure we just talk through some of the skill building that we know to be most important for students related to successfully transitioning from special education to adulthood. So, right, if we're going to put time and energy into this process, we need to know what skills make a big difference. These are 6 skills that have been highlighted for significantly impacting success and satisfaction when students on IEPs transition to adulthood. Self-awareness, goal setting, perseverance, use of available resources, emotional coping strategies, self-determination, and meaningful employment. I cannot emphasize enough that students need to be able to report accurate information regarding their strengths and their disability-related needs. And they need to be able to express the types of accommodations they need for success. And frankly, they need to be able to fight for the accommodations that they need for success, right? You have to be able to push and advocate sometimes. Students need to be aware of their strengths and limitations and to use their self-awareness to guide their decision making. And this starts with, I mean, if we think about it, like some of this starts with being able to explain some of the things that are right in the IEP, right? Like just knowing I'm a kid who has a diagnosis and I'm on an IEP and here are the accommodations that have been helpful to me, right? And here are all these amazing things that I can do when I'm appropriately accommodated. In addition to self-awareness, goal setting is a critical transition skill. Students need to be able to name specific and realistic goals, conceive of a way to measure that goal, determine strategy and step-by-step process that's necessary, develop a timeline, take steps toward completing a goal, assess progress and completion, and adjust as needed, right? Students can participate in systematic learning of goal setting and attainment, right? Like part of the IEP process can certainly be instruction and practice with goal setting, but they also have to understand the importance of setting goals and striving for goals. I mean, the nice thing is if we're engaging students in the team meeting process, this is a huge part of this process, right? Perseverance is another important skill that requires knowing when to back up, change course, and ask for help, being persistent to a point, flexibility and adaptability, the ability to adopt new strategies and redefine goals, and accepting and learning from failures. We have to be able to fail. It develops through others explicitly modeling grit, practicing with support, making logical connection between actions and motivators, believing you can achieve success, and others supporting that belief. Right? If a lot of people are doing things for me, it may be sending a message to me that they don't think I can do things for myself. So we just need to be really cognizant of helping to give our students opportunities and bolster the fact that we believe that they can do things, and give them the chance to take risks. When we constantly over accommodate and knock down barriers or enable students to avoid taking risks and failing, we prevent students from learning perseverance. Um, I just think about I've got an 8-year-old right now, and I saw some math homework come home where he didn't want to write his answer out, as the teacher wrote it out for him, and he's not on an IEP. This is totally something that's available just as a general education accommodation. But like my panic as a transition specialist who panics about my own children, right, was like, if we're already accommodating somebody not feeling like writing, like what does that turn into over time? So I'm always just thinking about, is this an appropriate accommodation or an over accommodation? And on that day, it was an appropriate accommodation, but boy, did I need to know if that was appropriate or not. And like what the plan was for making sure that wasn't going to be a lifelong accommodation, right? So I just, we really have to be thoughtful about that. Anytime you're doing something for the student, for a kid, it's like, do I have to do this? Am I doing it because of time? What is it? How do we give some opportunity for students to learn to persevere through challenges? Use of available resources is another variable that has to do with the presence and use of effective support systems. This requires knowing that you need help, knowing what help is available, and being able to ask for the right kind of help. It's not about waiting around and hoping for help to come, but seeking support from individuals. It builds upon self-awareness and self-advocacy. I think this gets complicated, and it's complicated on the parent and guardian and companion side of things, because when you're used to an IEP process, you're used to, no matter how coordinated or not coordinated that process is, it's all sort of in a document, right? Like there's a hub there. And so if help is needed, right, like it's sort of somewhere in there. In adult life, it's just not like that. Like different types of help come from different types of people. I think so specifically, like if you're going to transition to using vocational support from Mass Rehab Commission and you're a student who's thinking of a college degree, then you're working with VR specialists, right? If you're a student who might be more suited for a certificate or on the job training and it's specifically related to science and technology, then you're working with Next Gen. And like one person doesn't know what the other person does and vice versa. So it's like you have to know who can help you with what, and you have to know what your goals are. And we know that that makes a difference. And then certainly students also need to develop effective means of reducing and coping with stress and frustration and other emotional aspects of having a disability, but also just what happens in life. So just like goal setting, coping strategies develop when students are allowed to take risks, and also with explicit social emotional learning. So if students are building coping strategies in therapy or school-based counseling, one of the things that's so important is where are the objectives that are showing that that student is generalizing those coping strategies to real world situations. It's great to be able to talk about a situation where you were frustrated. What I want to know though is like, where are we actually generalizing so that the student is coping in the situations that are frustrating, right? And then how close are those situations to what that student's going to have to persevere through as they're progressing on to adulthood. Transition planning itself is stressful, so you have to be able to cope with a lot of this, right? You're going to have the coping strategies just to engage in the process. The second to last skill I want to talk about is self-determination. But this is definitely the most important. Like research time and time again shows that this is the most important thing we can do for our kids. It builds from many of the other described skills. So this slide includes 2 definitions of self-determination that both come from fact sheets that were put together by the Division on Career Development and Transition from CEC. So they also did that definition of transition assessment. The first is the most current, but I really do like them both. Self-determination is the ability to make choices and solve problems and set goals, evaluate options, take initiative to reach one's goals, and accept the consequences of one's actions. But self-determination is also just being able to make choices and decisions about one's own life without any more support than is necessary. We all need support, but when are we overusing that, right? Um, when students are self-determined, they have a sense of control over their destiny and a belief that they have some sort of effect on the outcome of their life. They assume more responsibility for their actions and outcomes, and they're proactive, right? They're engaged. Self-determination develops with students having frequent opportunities for choice making, problem solving, and goal setting. And again, like participation in the IEP process itself is an evidence-based way to build self-determination skills, which is something I love about the new form and process, right? There's that opportunity for student voice to be included throughout. We have student and parent concerns now, which was feedback I actually provided. I was like, if we're going to focus on the student, let's make sure students listed first. Um, and it's just this form is calling for student engagement, but the reality is like student engagement is what makes our students more successful when they exit public education. So we should all be on the same page about that. And when we keep students away from IEP meetings, we're actively delaying students being able to advocate for themselves in meaningful ways in their adult lives. If there are team dynamics that prevent students from being part of a team, those need to be addressed and changed. Students need to learn about IEPs, and we should not be letting lack of parent knowledge or staff training or sort of like our ability to work together. None of that should be preventing students from being able to actively engage in this process, right? We need to address whatever we need to address to make sure that voice is in the room. And that doesn't mean they have to sit through every painful minute of every meeting, although eventually I'd love to get there. But we really need to be thoughtful about this. And even I was on a Zoom meeting yesterday for a student, and it was an IEP meeting. We having a good transition planning discussion, but this was a student who had some language-based challenges, and so because it was a Zoom meeting, and we didn't have any sort of draft IEP. We're talking about the goal areas, but there was no visual for this student. And it's just, one of the things that I sort of was thinking about, I was like, okay, for next year, we need visuals for this meeting. And we can think about whether it's an IEP objective for a student to help create visuals for the meeting, or whether the educators are just going to provide that because that's what special educators are great at, right? Is modifying, providing creative supports. But we really need to think about how we are making this an accessible process. Um, this can start at home, right? I talk a lot about my kids. For my 11-year-old, we're talking a lot about the fact that I go to team meetings for him. If I go to teacher conferences, I ask what he wants me to ask about. Is there anything he wants me to share? I'm not saying this goes beautifully every time. I'm just saying we can we can be working towards this. The great thing about IEP participation, again, is that self-awareness and self-determination and self-advocacy can all be integrated in this process. Students learn about their strengths, especially using the new form. We've got all sorts of strengths and preferences columns, and they learn about their disability related needs, and they learn about why they have accommodations and that they have accommodations, that these things aren't just appearing, for all humans, right? Students also practice goal setting and advocating. And even though research shows that student-led IEPs can be highly effective, research also shows that adults aren't prepared yet for this, so we need to work together ahead of time to set the stage. Right now, what we know is that when they do a lot of research on team meetings, typically the team lead talks the most, students speak the least, parents are usually second least. There can be shifting dynamics depending on who else is in the room. But student IEPs, student-led IEPs in particular, shift this dynamic and prepare students to be ready to advocate for themselves after high school. This slide describes step-by-step ways to include students, right? So making sure a student knows what their rights are and like what the IEP process is. Being part of some part of the meeting, right? Reviewing their IEP with a parent or professional. And that doesn't mean you plunk down a 52-page IEP in front of a student. We pick and choose the parts to start with, right? Over time, learning about the whole thing, maybe preparing a script to be part of a team meeting, maybe preparing a PowerPoint presentation or brochure about themselves. But the ultimate goal is that by the time students exit public education, that they've had the opportunity to lead their meeting, right? That they get a chance to sort of be in charge of the process because they understand it so well. I also say, it's like if a student can't be present for whatever reason, maybe they could meet with team members before the meeting, right? Like just thinking about how do we, again, this is a really important part of the process. How do we facilitate that? This is a visual I love, which is a brochure that can be used for helping to first encourage students to be involved in their IEP process and increase their involvement over time. It comes from, it's on the side here, www.imdetermined.org. Um, they have a number of incredible resources for helping students, helping parents, helping educators figure out how to involve students in this process. But I love just like all these different ideas. Something as simple as like you're inviting a general educator to a meeting and like who's really important to the student. I've had students who were really attached to the school janitor and had a great relationship with them. Can we get that person in the room? Scheduling can be tricky, but like these are the things we need to be asking. Like, who do you want to be part of your team? Can we make certain lists ahead of time? I've had student. I love when teams have students responsible for writing a goal or being, part of writing other things, but it can also be preparing materials, right? Like sending the invitation. There's just so many different things we can be doing ahead of time to get students excited and engaged in this process, and then their ideas for during and after. And the last skill that I want to mention, self-determination is the most important, but oh boy, this skill is also incredibly important, is engagement in meaningful employment, which is also a predictor of success in college and adult life. So having paid work in high school predicts success with post-secondary learning and predicts that you might have paid work later in life, right? So, but there are some other things that are important. Just being able to express the desire for a job that matches along with some of your career interests, right? Getting alignment between those things. Demonstrating job readiness skills such as being on time and completing work as assigned and working cooperatively, the ability to do teamwork, right? Successfully participating in career technology courses or job training programs. And as I said before, obtaining a paid job, even a summer job. So really thinking about how are we thinking and engaging students related to employment when they're in high school. This is just a list of some of the skills that students can develop when they participate in employment or career-related instruction in high school. And these are really the skills that employers look for when hiring, retaining, and promoting employees. So I think we can be really focused on college transition in Massachusetts, and that's great. But I'm hoping we also want our kids to be employed, and the law requires, community-based employment. That's what we should be aiming for with the IEP. So we need to be thinking about these kinds of skills, critical thinking and problem solving. I'm not going to read these all, but these are very important, and especially some of these professional skills, which are tricky. I'm not saying like there are variations, workplace to workplace, and there's room for identity in all of this, but just thinking about how important all of this is. In addition to focusing on those skill areas, it's really important to think about how we're minimizing accommodations across settings and over time. And I know this is so hard. Families may have really, and teams may have thought really hard about providing one-to-one support for student in a classroom, but oftentimes that may actually be preventing the student from developing some of the skills on the last slide. And it also doesn't exist in real life, right? It doesn't exist past high school. Students who want to be allowed access to the community or work in adult life need to be able to function at least at a 1-to-4 or 1-to-5 staff ratio. Sometimes it's closer to 1-to-6 or 1-to-8. So we really don't want our students exiting still needing one-to-one support around the clock, because that's just an automatic limitation of ability to function in the community later. And I would encourage you to think about probably not going home tonight, but tomorrow at home, tomorrow at school, is there one thing you could do differently that might help a student to be doing something more for themselves? Probably not learning to set the alarm clock tomorrow on Halloween, but maybe over the weekend or for next week, right? Reducing one adult prompt, setting the table, heating up a meal. Like, is there just one, like start small, right? But we just need to start shifting that mindset of how can we minimize where we're accommodating and maximize where students are learning to do things for themselves. I also want to mention automaticity, which is the ability to do things without occupying the mind with the low-level details required, right? So not having to really think about it, allowing it to become an automatic response pattern or habit. And it's usually the result of learning and repetition and practice. So it is not enough to be able to do something 80% of the time with 1 to 2 prompts, right? It's not enough to be able to cross the street 80% of the time with 1 to 2 prompts. We really need to be thinking about doing skills automatically, right? Sometimes we put them on maintenance so that we're making sure that they're still happening over time as we're adding other skills too. And once a skill's automatic, take it on the road, right? So maybe you can use the debit card at Walmart, but what about Target? Like generalizing that skill from one place to another is an enormous stressor for me. And it's an opportunity to practice coping skills, right? But it's also sort of just understanding that things don't look the same in every single environment. And then maybe it's learning how to advocate when you're not sure how to use the debit card machine, right? So just thinking about what the skills are, but how are we using those across settings? Additionally, as I mentioned before, as students get older, we need to rethink what a team looks like. These are a bunch of relationship-based supports. Some are eligibility specific, thinking about who are the family members that are going to be engaged for our kids. Are there friends or family friends? Dating relationships, familiar staff at local stores, roommates, coworkers, other people with shared interests and hobbies, right? So there are a number of different people, service providers, advocacy groups, so many different people. We don't want the only team that's part of our kids' lives to be the IEP team. We really want to be thinking about how we're building community for longer. And evidence certainly indicates that authentic relationships with community members dramatically impact safety in the community. So I always think about for my more vulnerable students, I want them to be the mayors. I want them to know everyone. I saw something on social media yesterday where somebody had asked about, like, should I introduce my student to, my child to the police? And I think oftentimes there are lots of good reasons to do that, to make sure that law enforcement are familiar with an adult in the community. Just but also, like, I want them to know the people at the grocery store, the restaurant, whatever, right? Like, the more people that know and like your kid, the more the safer the community is. You're going to be watching out. Make sure to plan ahead for transportation. If you can't get somewhere, you cannot have it. I don't care how great you are at work at a cash register. If you have no way to get to the store to work there, you can't have it, right? Getting a license is not the same as being able to use it. Students need to know what to do if they're pulled over, if they're in a fender bender, if they have a flat tire, if they're at a four-way stop, or at least have have a wallet card or some steps in their phone that they know to follow when something unexpected happens. They need to take time to plan routes, leave time to reduce stress and reduce speeding. Think about weather, think about when they're going to listen to music or not. What do they do with their phone? Like, there's so much that goes into transportation, and many students need to learn to use public transit or even paratransit or ADA transportation. And it's not just that because your child qualifies for van transportation that they don't need a lot of skills to use it, because you do. It's executive function, social safety skills, and a lot of coping, because sometimes transportation is not reliable. And don't forget technology and assistive technology. I think of tech as one of the best ways to go from being human prompt dependent to using a self-accommodation. I just talked about this in that IEP meeting yesterday. I think about, like, anything, anything that's sitting in the accommodations in the IEP, is it something that could actually be accommodated with a technology tool that a student could take with them? That they don't actually need someone else to do that for them. And certainly if we're talking anything human prompted, right? These are just some different ideas, speech to text, text to speech, spell checker, picture dictionaries, text magnification, tools for test taking, writing, note taking, reference, graphic organizers, draft builders, assistive listening, for auditory processing, proofreading, math tools, geolocation. And I will say, and like Instacart, right? Like, just Instacart, those pill packs that come in the mail, like, just thinking about, and honestly, like, technology is gonna going to move so much faster than we can even think for our students and for our kids. There are apps online right now that do, like, full-on task analyses of tasks and come up with the to-do steps to do them. And so, like, whereas students needed to know how to independently think of all the steps now, they could use a technology tool to do that, right? Like, let's use technology to support students, but let's make sure they know how to do that independently, right? These are a number of resources. They'll be in the slides. People who are registered will get copies of these slides. This is NESCA's contact information. Um, there is a webinar that I happen to be doing with a colleague next week, specifically on college transition that's free if anyone's interested in that. I just wanted to share that information. It's 11 o'clock next Wednesday. And then I also, NESCA we have a guide to transition planning in the new Massachusetts IEP that you guys can check out. It's part of our blog. NESCA has an awesome blog. Every single clinician and transition specialist contributes to it. I learned so much from my colleagues. So just wanted to share that as well. And I did not make it to leave 20 minutes for questions, but I left 15. So I'm hoping we get some some good questions and really like feel free to ask about anything I've presented, but other transition service and planning questions are welcome. And then I always just ask, try to make the questions general enough. And also just remember that this is being recorded so that we can make this relevant for everyone in the audience. But please feel free to follow up with me after. Hopefully my email was on the very first slide. If not, Jane will provide that for you guys.
Yeah. So we do have a bunch of questions that cropped up in the chat. And some of these may have been addressed or touched upon, but I just want to make sure that they are covered here. Please speak to who drives or identifies the post-secondary goals. In New Hampshire, there's an emphasis on the goals being the students' goals, not those of others, regardless of the perception surrounding achievability.
Yeah, so there's a tension here. I think the question is like, who who determines achievability? I think there's a real tendency for all humans to underestimate the students. I know I'm guilty of this for my own kid, far less than the students I work with, but definitely with my own kid. Um, and so the reality is post-secondary goals need to be based on age-appropriate transition assessment. And for some students, age-appropriate transition assessment is absolutely like interviewing them as long as it's a student who has already had access to knowledge about what their options are, right? Or who's being, um, but so there are times that, like it's a student naming some goals, and that's totally appropriate for the process. There are, I absolutely want to also see information from other team members about goals as part of age-appropriate transition assessment, and especially for younger students. Because like honestly, part of how we set our goals in adulthood is taking into account like influence of other people who know us well, right? um, but it is student voice that drives the goals, but they should not be like so unrealistic. That we're not able to come up with meaningful transition services for the student. And so it might be that in seventh grade, the student's going to be in the NBA, but then we've provided some transition services during eighth grade to really try to hone in on like, what would that look like? And what are you already doing to get ready for the NBA? And, like we might end up driving down to a student who's working in concessions at the Boston Garden, right? Like the idea is that what we're doing is putting appropriate transition services into place so that the student can so that everyone is on the same page about those post-secondary goals by the time the student exits, right? And I also just want to caution, like, it's not our job. It's not our job as educators or as parents to tell a student what their goals are. Like, we can absolutely guide and inform, but there's a certain amount of dignity and respect that we also have to afford to the students. And then when it comes down to it, like a lot of times what needs to be done this year as a ninth grader is going to be the same for many kids, regardless of a huge number of outcomes. So it's like if we're also looking at the building blocks and not so focused on is this realistic or not realistic, we can still create good transition plan for this particular school year and hopefully put in some things that are going to help a student to really test out their vision over time. I hope that was I know that was a long answer, but like I guess in short, unrealistic goals are okay as long as they're based on a and we're thinking about transition services to make them more realistic over time. And certainly, like if someone's going to rely on service providers, that has to be added as part of the goals. Um, all right, next question, Jane.
Can you talk about other paths students can take when they can't pass the MCAS?
Yeah, so one of the and I'm like obviously we're all waiting to see what happens in Massachusetts with the MCAS. So like there may be some things that I don't know 2 weeks from now, but right now if you're on a if you pass the MCAS and you're awarded a state standard diploma, honestly, one of the things that is primarily important for is if you want to traditionally enter college, right? Like you're going to have to produce that high school transcript indicating that you have a diploma. The interesting thing is there are a lot of employment applications that ask when you exited high school or that ask like where you went to high school, but they don't ask did you get a diploma? So, something to think about is like the diploma versus a certificate of attainment that may not that may not matter as much as we think it does for certain career trajectories. It does often for the additional training and learning trajectories. And so that's one thing to think about. But oftentimes, there's a correlation there of that some of the programs that the student would need to where a student would need to have that diploma are also because the student needs the skills that were needed to pass that MCAS. Um, and so, I'm just always thinking about like other training options and hopefully that's answering the question effectively. I guess it's just don't assume that not passing MCAS is an automatic limitation to employment, or even like frankly, we have inclusive education options. And then you can take some college classes even if you didn't get a diploma, and then you get to check off some college on your job applications. So I don't tend to think of MCAS as the end all be all, even though I know it can really feel important for somebody to have an official diploma at home. What
So
else?
this one was pertaining to those that last set of skills like the self-awareness, self-determination. How are these skills being taught, and what school professional is teaching these? And then there was this another comment about just noting that the school isn't solely responsible for teaching those.
Right. No, but I think yes. So, I hope that on the self-determination slides it was clear, and I think I said that some of that does start at home, right? Like there are conversations that we need to be having at home, and there are so many opportunities at home, like planning a party, planning a family trip, planning a meal, right? Where we can engage our students in self-determination activities. Absolutely. And I promise you, your child will not be successful in transitioning to adulthood if your expectation is that the public school is going to do everything as far as transition planning. That's not possible, right? We need to be really collaborative in this process. We need to be doing whatever we can at home, and then we need to acknowledge these are the things I can't do at home and I need help with, right? Like, and it gets harder as kids get older. They certainly are going to listen to you less as parents. So that is when you're going to have to rely on some other people. But that's why I also think it's so important to make sure we have community agencies involved, right? Independent living centers are so awesome because they will support individuals with disabilities at any age. And their goal is for those individuals to live independently in their community lifelong. And so they have things like peer mentoring and transition programs, and they can help with the driving piece, right? So it is really thinking about who can do what to push this forward. As far as self-determination, and if we're specifically thinking about the IEP process, that gets complicated because the reality is we're training our special educators on this process better than we're training our parents on this. So then I would look and say, is the district doing parent training to make sure that parents can also support this at home if that's part of what we're doing? Um, I think it absolutely has to be a team conversation about like who can do what and when. But I honestly believe that even for somebody who's 5, we could be using some of these free self-determination assessments and looking at students' skills to be self-determined at early ages and thinking about what needs to be worked on outside of school and what really does need to be part of an IEP process, right? If a kid's working on self-advocacy and there are no opportunities to self-advocate throughout the school day, that's a problem, right? But it's also the same as if a kid is working on self-advocacy and there are no opportunities to self-advocate at home. So it's absolutely a team effort, and there are many times that it's really appropriate for that to be an annual goal or a set of objectives or objectives within goals for a student. I'm working on math, and I am learning how to accommodate when I need to use or how to advocate when I need to use my calculator, right? Like, just really thinking about how are we helping students to develop that voice.
Do you find the summary of student performance valuable, and when and how should that be done?
So, summary of student performance, right, is an exit document that students are supposed to leave with when they exit public education. Yes, it's a helpful document. I mean, it's sort of the baseline for what's going on when a kid leaves public education. And depending on which human service providers they're working with next or where they maybe transition to after that, I mean, that's really critical information, right? We're putting energy into some of these students from ages 3 through 22 for some of these students. Special education is organized, right? And sort of centralized. And so there's a lot of great information about a student. So we want, good summary of performance to come out of that process to go on to the people helping the student next. So yes, absolutely, I see that as useful, especially for people who are going to work with the student after. And you really need to remember, um, as hard as it is in education, where sometimes our teachers need to shift school districts and other things, human services is far more challenging, right? And we are understaffed in that area. And this sort of average length of stay for providers is quite short in many different human service agencies. So our kids are going to be supported by many, many, many different people, and having good documentation with them can be extremely helpful.
Okay. How can adult students advocate to get apprenticeships and on-the-job training?
Adult students who are still part of the IEP process. Um, I mean, I think the important thing is to really be thinking about, again, like if we're talking apprenticeships and if we're talking about on-the-job training opportunities, there might be some of that that's more the on-the-job training stuff might be something that's part of happening during special education. But I would hope that we're really reaching out to our career centers, right? Like our mass hire career centers and looking at the job training opportunities that we have. And those aren't even necessarily disability specific, although plenty of adults who are using career centers, right, may have different reading levels or may have disabilities or other things. And then we also want to be working with pre-ets and with vocational rehab providers. I think it's a lot to expect, right? Like I think about all of the things that we ask teachers to learn and special educators to learn, and transition still even like just such a small portion of that. And then we're talking about having enough expertise to help people find internships and apprenticeships and on the job training. It's like, why not pull in the organizations that already have expertise in employment? So part of the advocacy would be to check in with your school district around like who are they connected with that are employment experts and employment supports in the community. But you can also make some of those connections with your young adult.
What should a quality transition process look like? How should parents and students advocate to obtain information about that?
I mean, I'm hoping that that's what a lot of this transition presentation went through, right? I mean, a quality transition process has to involve having adequate data when we're filling out the IEP and completion for transition age students, right? So the first question is like, are we missing information that we need about the student? Are we missing information that would help to set those goals or that would define what services they need? And then I think like the next step in the quality transition planning process is if we are missing information, like how have we organized to get that information, sort of over time for that student, and not we're going to wait until the kid's 17, but sort of we have a plan in place to get some more of this information this year, and we're putting services in place. There are a number of great transition timelines that are out there. I've done a blog for NESCA on transition timelines, not for NASCAR, for NESCA, if you're reading the captions. Um, but I've done a blog that highlights some of my favorite ones. There's a great one from Autism Housing Pathways has certain things, but like Federation has one. There are a number of them. So I would say absolutely just look at like NESCA blog transition timelines, and you'll get some of my favorite timelines that can give you some sense of like what needs to happen when during this process. But I mean, a really quality process means that a student has clearly defined goals and that we're even better defining those over time. And that we have a good handoff in place to whatever next life steps are for that student. right? I mean, I just we know it's not a good process if the kid's leaving and we still don't know if they want to go to a 2-year college or get a certificate, right? Like that's really one of the biggest things we need to be doing is the goals, those long-term goals.
What is the difference between pre-ETS and outside vendor services? How can students maximize the use of both?
I'm not quite sure I understand. So pre-employment transition services is not typically directly delivered through Mass Rehab Commission. It is delivered through vendors who have contracted with Mass Rehab Commission to be providing those services. So you would get your pre-employment transition services from a specific vendor who's being funded by Mass Rehab Commission. You can work with any pre-employment transition service vendor in the state, but you can only work with one at a time. They can't like double dip. The state is so careful about not, you can't have public education while you have adult services. You can't have more than one pre-employment transition service vendor at a time. Um, so I guess when I think of vendors, I'm thinking of employment vendors, but there are ways to work with other career centers or independent living centers, or bring in, other family support center, autism support center, waiver dollars, other things like that. But you would just be working with one provider or vendor who delivers those pre-ed services.
And should the service delivery grid still look like 5 days a week, 5 days per week in school when the student has college or part-time jobs in their goals?
That's a complicated question because every district and not even that, like every placement is going to do their service delivery grid just a little differently. I mean, I think in an ideal world, what's on the service delivery grid is what are the services the student specifically needs to be able to make progress in those goals this year, and to be able to make progress towards their post-secondary goals. So there could absolutely be times that a student's engaging in activities where there's not an actual service being provided that might not be part of that grid. I mean, I think the reality is we want to see the environments that services are happening in shift over time. And then we want to make sure we've documented exactly what the level of services are that the student needs.
And then we've had a request for another Ask the Transition Expert workshop.
I love, like, if I could just do Q&A for hours and hours and hours, I would absolutely enjoy that. So Jane and I will figure out a time to make that happen. And whoever made the request, if you want to let Jane know if you think evening or daytime ends up being better. I mean, as a working parent myself, I find it really hard to figure out which of those is more challenging to make time in. Yeah, that's something that I hope that we can do, more often over time. Um, and certainly, I mean, something that I don't know if I made clear is we do offer just consultation at NESCA. Families can come into NESCA a lot of different ways. You don't have to have a neuropsychological evaluation with us to access our transition services. You don't have to have a transition assessment to have consultation with me. We provide lots of support to school districts. They do assessment on their own. Like there are a lot of different ways that we work with families and with teams. And that, absolutely, sometimes it's really appropriate to just have a consultation so that you can have full records reviewed so that any information you're getting isn't as broad as the information that I'm giving tonight.
Um, well, thank you, everyone. If you do have any follow-up questions, I've included Kelley's email and my email as well. Please do feel free to reach out. I've attached the presentation here as well. And as I mentioned in the chat, I can certainly follow up with that by email to everyone who registered too.
And then Jane, just if you make sure you save the chat. I would love that.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much for coming and staying and listening so intently and all the great questions. Again, thank you to all three CPACs, to Nashoba, to Maynard, and to Northborough Southborough PAC for hosting us. I don't think I mentioned this, but I'm an Algonquin graduate, so it was really nice to to get to do this one for Northborough Southborough. And just thank you so much for everybody for your time.
Thank you. Take care.